Greetings to you who is watching, listening to this, likely on the Mythic Masculine Network. My conversation today with Amanda Fiorino. Did I say that right?
You did.
Excellent. Was meant to be a live conversation, though the weather decided to entangle with the technology. And so we're recording this separate, not live, but separate on Zoom, and will have been posted at this point to you, the future listener, the future watcher, in an offering of this theme around grief. And there'll be, the plan, at least in this moment, would be to offer a little bit of unpacking of how Amanda's approached this and how she crafted the overview of the new moon theme here on the network, and then to offer up a practice of lament portal. Altar? Portal?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Lament portal. Yeah.
Yeah, lament portal. As a practice actually over the weekend, this weekend in December, and of course at any moment when it's a practice that you wish to invite in. So that's our territory, and also there are likely some emergent surprises to come. And just like to say welcome, Amanda.
Thank you, Ian. It's really wonderful to be here.
Mm.
And grateful that there's enough parting in the clouds and canyon pathways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I understand you may have had a poem to kick us off. Is that still the case?
I do. And some have probably encountered this poem either from Frances Weller's book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, or just separate from it. And the poet is Pesha Gertler, and her poem is The Healing Time. Mm. And I wanted to just bring this in because there's a way in which our experiences, particularly heavily charged emotional experiences, can be perceived through the current cultural lens as less than or bad or negative, or even quote unquote dark in particular ways of defining dark, not as something fecund and transformative and delicious. And so she says, finally on my way to yes, I bump into all the places where I said no to my life. I bump into all the places where I said no to my life. All the untended wounds, the red and purple scars, those hieroglyphs of pain carved into my skin and bones, those coded messages that send me down the wrong street again and again where I find them. Again and again, where I find them, again and again, where they find me, the old wounds, the old misdirections. And I lift them, I lift them one by one close to my heart. I lift them one by one close to my heart, those coded messages, those wounds and purple scars, red scars, hieroglyphs of pain carved into my skin and bones. I lift them one by one close to my heart. And I say, holy, holy. Finally, on my way, yes, I bump into all the places where I said no to my life, all the untended wounds, the red and purple scars, those hieroglyphs of pain carved into my skin and bones, those coded messages that send me down the wrong street again and again where I find them, the old wounds, the old misdirections, and I lift them one by one, by one, by one. And I hold them close to my heart and I say, holy, holy.
Beautiful.
Agreed.
I mean, there's so many lines I wanted to chase down. And, I wonder, knowing we have a shortened amount of time today for this call, but, part of me still wants to initially wrestle a bit with what do we mean when we say grief? Because I know on the network, those of us who joined the council, we were able to unpack that a little bit too. And And it was brought up as well, the sense of, do we have a shared understanding of grief, or do different people coming from different lineages, different experiences, do they think it's the same thing? And what I heard there for you, when what you shared there in the poem, again, it was a very almost alchemical relationship to it. And maybe part of me just wants to offer, my initial take that I'm showing up with, and then kind of over to you for some of your sharing on it. And I would say briefly, for a long time, I felt grief was just kind of feeling depression, feeling a lot of sadness, oftentimes around a particular, deeply wounding or sad threshold. It could be a death, it could be something else, but that grief was like a visitation, and then you're really meant to get on with it at the sort of appropriate time. And in that sense, grief was really a feeling that you dealt with because something negative happened, and then you move on. And then it was largely through my time in the Orphan Wisdom School with Stephen Jenkinson, who's also been called the grief walker, that he began to sketch a very different portrait of grief. And just the little highlights for me have been that understanding that grief it's a verb, and that grief is something you do. And by that, it starts to invoke a sort of skillfulness around grief, that grief is actually a skill, that grief is not inevitable in grief-soaked situations. Anyone that's ever been to a funeral and maybe looked around and, or many dry eyes and maybe awkward kind of stoic looks and, keep it together and the rest, is sort of seen as a virtue instead of perhaps like a deep inability, actually, which I've come to now understand it. And I'd also say that, linking it a bit to the mythopoetic, Robert Bly talks about in the chapter in Iron John, the Road of Ashes, which invokes this image of the archetype of the grief man. And he speaks of that men often carry a grief tone, actually, that sort of is a sign of getting it, like a sign of, oh, like this is not, it's not grievance, as in it's not something that shouldn't be, the fact that beings age, beings die, beings participate in this, caravan of life. But that grief is actually an appropriate tone to the whole thing. It's a way of loving that which is still here and grieving that which isn't. And so in that sense, they're deeply interwoven, I think, with, in a sense, of mature masculinity. And I would argue, certainly in a rich feminine, if we want to even use that language as well. But so that's somewhat of what I'm showing up with in terms of this conversation. And I was appreciative that Amanda was willing to lend some of her gifts in writing and language, and her encounters with grief and her wrestling with it to the network. And so I'd love to turn it over to you as well to share a little bit of some of what you touched on in your writing, but also what comes to you now as being able to articulate what has grief come to mean to you.
Yeah, I love all of what you just shared there, and the different threads from Bly and Jenkinson, and the ways we're all entangling with one another, and the ways that grief speaks to that entanglement or even elucidates it, that it's where grief arises because of our, as a former mentor of mine likes to say, the inging between things, the relating that's happening amongst all of us. And I think one of the things that's really stood out to me my whole life is that I'm an incredibly emotive person, an expressive person, and I attribute some of that to some of my ancestry. Some of my ancestry is the Greek and the Macedonian, and Sicilian is very, very fiery and emotive. And while simultaneously growing up within a familial webwork where both of my parents were more or less really disconnected from the experience of vulnerability and the experience of being undone by something much larger than themselves, which I think is a mark of our culture, which resulted in a particular kind of defensiveness. So it resulted in their emoting, but it was an emoting that came out of a realm of defensiveness, of trying to create a barrier between themselves and life.
Mm.
And I watched that growing up and have wondered, continue to wonder, and the wondering takes me all manner of places. What is it that enables any one particular person? What renders them capable of being able to experience grief? And I wrote in that piece, the stance that I have is that grief is more like a creature that we could go to worship, and that is inspired by a lot of the older cosmologies that are present in my own ancestral cultures and other cultures as well. And one of the examples that I do like to call upon is actually from more of the Norse traditions with the cosmology of Ragnarok. And it was the Viking cosmology, the Viking story of the ending of the world, the apocalypse. And Angerboda, who's not a well-known figure, which isn't surprising. She's not a well-known figure in Ragnarok, but she is the mother of all of the children that actually bring about the end of the world. And her consort is Loki, the trickster god. And she is this, she's from Jotunheim. She's a Jotun, she's a giantess. And her name, Angerboda, anger is actually the root word of what we have now today as anger. And in that translation, in its older form, it actually meant grief. And so her name, Angerboda, means bringer of grief, or the one who brings grief. And I, we could immediately make, through the certain cultural lenses that we might be looking through, we might translate that as something bad, negative. But instead, I love to look at it as this deification and personification of what grief as an ecological force, as a cosmic force of worldings and unworldings, of terraings. And some of that is from Donna Haraway's work, The Worldings and Unworldings. And I really especially see that in that story, because when Jormungand, who's one of her children, who's the big world serpent, releases his tail, it initiates the crumbling of the current world. And then Fenrir, who's one of her other children, is this big massive wolf, and he is on one half of the world, engulfing it in flames, and then Jormungand is on the other half, spitting venom and acid. And
wow.
which for our times is a little eerie in some sense, because of what we see happening with the earth, such as the forests and the oceans and the acidification and the burning. And then her other child is Hel, who is the goddess of the underworld and death. And so we have these three children that spring from this chthonic mother, who is the bringer of grief. And I think it's this really apt cosmogonic, there's that word, the cosmological story that I feel really encompasses what grief can feel like and what it's capable of, is that it's a force that comes in and truly transforms us, that it's not really where that we, you spoke of how Jenkinson spoke to grief as you're doing something, but if we were to flip that in the way that our culture usually understands doing things, we don't do something with the grief in the way that we're more culturally inclined to think about doing. But that grief is actually happening to us. It is an immense force that's coming in that if we're capable of it, if we're willing, we can actually give ourselves over to. And I like to think of it as when rains come in, like torrential rains on a mountainside, and there's no way you'd be able to stand on the mountainside and with a piece of string or a marker go, this is exactly where the rain and water are going to fall, and this is how it will be shaped. Instead, beautifully, you have to allow the rains to come in and relationally entangle with the space and simply be present with the way the rains and the land are meeting one another. And then after the fact, almost like on the other side, you look and you see, oh, I've been reshaped.
Mm. I mean, I'm struck in that description of the pantheon of the goddess and her children. I mean that, you know, it seems to be true cosmologies of relationship. You know, from a modern mind, they might say sort of personify psychological forces or anthropomorphize, you know, the world that isn't actually, you know, it's just what it is. It's just stuff. It's not human. And I guess what I'm hearing is that, I mean, that's like a modern interpretation often of a very sophisticated and kind of like actual relationship to these forces and to these beings. And I'm just referring or reminded of something that Stephen said one time around psychology, actually, which is, depending on who you talk to, you know, could really ruffle a few feathers. But what he said was, psychology is monotheism without God.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, there's lots to be said about that. But I mean, the way I take it even now too, is that, you know, largely the modern project has sort of internalized everything. So it's just psychological. So in some sense, there's no world anymore. There's only the psychological thing. And mythology often can get translated in this way, right? As a like, oh, well, yeah, like Loki is just, you know, the trickster in me. And, you know, like the underworld is just my underworld. And the problem with that is yeah, it loses that relationality, and suddenly the world disappears and it's all self-referential, and there's actually no sense of that, oh, actually there's beings outside of you that need to be fed and need to be in relationship to. And so in some sense, I feel grief is the same thing. Like grief has become primarily, I think, a sort of psychological happening, i.e. a feeling that you know, can get through and then get on with it. Whereas it feels like sophisticated cultures understand grief as like a visitation, you know, a deity that has a certain etiquette, that has a certain um, force that is outside of you, that, you know, you sort of are taken by or can be. And there is a skillfulness to that. And I guess that's what I'm kind of hearing as well, and what the invitations are into, like allowing it to have its way with you because of that intelligence, that it's actually present. And so often in the culture, it's you know, numbing out, it's blocking, or it's discomfort with the, like, you know, wild nature. And so just to loop it back a bit to your writing, I did appreciate how you really invited in kind of, yeah, an animalistic sort of inhabitation, I would say, of what that experience can be. And again, not even that it's an experience per se, but it is like, it's a participation in life, it feels like.
No, I love that. I keep going, please. Like, I love it's a participation. I was agreeing with you.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of participation, again, knowing that our time is shorter in our call, but I mean, maybe now is a moment to speak a bit about the invitation now of the Lament Portal in relation to that participation, right? And sketching it out. We will have a description as well of this just below the video, but yeah, if you wanted to speak to that now.
Yeah, that's let's see. So a part of, to frame it a little bit prior to going into it, and what you were also speaking to in what I had written, which is another piece in what I wrote, in the camp that I stand in, is that grief is not something specific to humans. And that was another way of saying it's an ecological force, but that it's not a human centric kind of a force or experience. And so this lament portal is a way of participating with the rest of the world and recognizing how, though our culture would leave us to feel as if we're alone in our grief, we're actually not alone. Though we do have an absence of community that knows how to actually hold grief, which is a point to grieve in and of itself. And
can I just test something really quick? Yeah, just to take into, you know, again, I'm sometimes I'm alert to a kind of like, we're all in the same boat kind of obviousness. And I just want to point out too, I mean, I fall into this, but I mean, yeah, not every person and culture has lost these arts. You know, a lot
Absolutely.
of them have, certainly because of the kind of devouring maw of modernity. But at the same time, I mean, if you're listening to this and you're like, well, what do you mean? I got, you know, my culture is really good at this. I mean, great, like,
Mhm.
great. And maybe this conversation is sort of a, yeah, it's a lament in some ways too, for if you do recognize yourself in the story, of which I would certainly count myself in that, as well as sounds like you as well, Amanda. So anyway, I just wanted to add that in as well, that, you know, that this is, I do believe, the story for so many in broadly speaking, you know, modernity.
Mhm.
And that's why this offering is here. So anyway, sorry, over to you.
Mhm. No, no, thank you for bringing that. That's why it is really, I am really specific about Western culture actually
Yeah.
being what is has an absence of community grief practices. um, and the ways that where I think many of us are starting to remember ancestral practices around grieving and grieving practices. Um, so the lament portal, this is that participation with the rest of the world, your entanglement with the world through this practice. And the invitation is to create a what you might call a holy space or sacred space that you can return to however many times you'd like. You could be several times a day or several times a week or several times a month. And it might be, depending on accessibility, it might be inside your house, it might be in your yard, it might be in the woods somewhere, it could be in the mountains or a canyon, by the ocean side where the ocean constantly remakes your grieving portal.
Mm.
And it's the idea that you're actually creating this space to willingly, intentionally step into a conversation with this creature grief, and to bring your sorrows and bring your furies and your angers and your heartbreaks to this place, and to offer them as a way of feeding your interconnectedness with all of life, as well as in the invocation of grief, practicing submitting yourself, surrendering yourself, offering yourself to this creature grief for it to come in and reshape you.
Mm.
And so you might develop, this is kind of like that self-created, though I don't like the word self-created, it's more like entangled creating of this practice, where you, if it's with, you know, the woods, or you're in a space that's perhaps not your home, you could, though you could do this with your own home, you could ask permission of the room, you could ask permission of sacred objects, but you'd be asking permission of a place as well. Good manners. You know, would this be okay if I create this lament portal here? And then it might be that the others, you start listening with these other senses of yours
Mm.
to the rocks and the flowers and the branches and the composted logs and anything else that's there, and invite them to participate and listen with your own body as to whether or not they're saying yes to it. And it might be that the rocks say yes, and you form a circle, a big circle that you can intentionally step into as if crossing a threshold or step out of. And this place might be something you bring
Mm.
offerings to. It might be, and offerings don't have to be something material, they could be song or poetry or your very tears or movement, gesture. um
Mm.
yeah. And
Beautiful.
I'm going to stop there for a minute.
Hmm. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm amen. That's what I got to say. I mean, is there any, that feels pretty beautifully articulated. I mean, especially as I mentioned, there'll be a write up posted just below the video. I mean, I'd be curious maybe if you just share some of your own experiences doing these kinds of practices as well.
Yeah. um so let's see, what would I what would I call upon here, particularly around self-created ceremony. I think that can be entangled ceremony. So one of the things that I would say is really letting your imagination come and play and participate, opening your whole imaginal body to the creation of this lament portal, and that there's no quote unquote right or wrong way. And you may even be mildly aware, if not deeply aware, of even an ancestral practice around grieving that you draw inspiration from as some way of the evolution of your own ancestral belonging. And so you're, like there's, in knowing that there's no right or wrong way, really allowing yourself to open up to all the possibilities of how you could imagine this coming into manifestation or fruiting itself, essentially. And some of the examples, like I love, whether it's in this particular offering of a lament portal or something else, singing my way to the space, or having a particular movement that is helping to shift consciousness, so to speak. And that might be even more like you're opening up your senses even more, that you're opening up those realms of perception even more. And then upon arriving, so to speak, to this lament portal, you might find yourself stopping and actually naming who it is that's arrived here at this lament portal. You're introducing yourself to grief, and you might do this over and over again because of who you are in any given day. So you might even start it at animus. We like to go with, I am the one who, and that leads us into more of a wider narrative around who we are, and also invites the constant emergent nature of who we are. I am the one who, and then you finish it. So that would be in a broader sense.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I'm struck by, my experience as well of times of ceremony or ritual where, I mean, there is something really powerful about speech, right? That I think, again, so often with the psychological framework of things that, they're sort of what we think internally or feel internally seems to be enough, in the sense of, as in, people have a hard time typically, and I know I have in the past, of actually like speaking out loud in these certain circumstances. When that has happened and there's been an invitation to speak, like you said, of, I'm the one who, or, even to speak, what do you hold grief about, or what comes to you through grief, and to speak that out loud. I think often, I mean, I've been surprised by what I say, actually, which is interesting, as in, it's almost like through the act of externalizing, it's sort of, you make visible what you actually think or feel, or what's there, and then that can often like kickstart a train of momentum into places, into emotions where had felt really locked up. Like, as in, I've had that experience too. So I just want to say that too, that there is something often can be awkward about the initial verbalizing, but that it is, it's not a mistake that we speak often of language as spelling, or conjuring, because it's very powerful, powerful gift to be able to do so. And in a way, invites those maybe marshaled close, or to listen, to be like, oh, are they for real? What do they have to say? Yeah, to the modern person, it can be, it's like a real disorienting practice that can really open up some, important places.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that. And especially the thought came to me of the moments I've had in the past where I'm in this space, and someone unlikely walks by, sees me in this space, and the interesting cultural dynamic there of being aware all of a sudden of that discomfort that our culture has around speaking in this particular manner. And one of the other two things actually that came up as you were speaking to that. One is in the speaking and the spell casting, which is what was running through my mind, as well as also noticing as you're speaking, how the rest of the world around you, even if you're in your house, noticing any kind of shifts or changes in the ecology that you're a part of. And if you're outside, especially, you might notice that maybe there's a chickadee that lands on the tree and perches and hangs for a while, and doesn't go away. And maybe there's an opportunity there for you to actually then share story with chickadee out loud. And And then the other piece was to kind of like in counsel format or counsel practice, to really drop into your own body and listen from the depths or the far reaching spaces of you, what wants to be spoken in this space.
Mm.
That you're not rushing yourself and you're taking your time. And I love one of the ways that I personally love to speak and write is to actually write from the place from which I'm feeling something rather than just abstracting it over and over again.
Mm.
And so it's allowing myself to feel what's occurring. And then from there, let the words form from or be birthed from that experiential place.
Mm.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, I think we're getting close to the end of our time here. And I wonder, yeah, is there anything left to offer now that you feel called to before we sort of set loose this invitation to everyone on the network?
Yeah. So one thing, actually, titration was one thing that I wanted to bring in, which is a resource, a tool, when, especially depending on what your current relationship with grief is, and just how disorienting the experience of grief can be, and the experience of emotions, no less, and that we live in a culture, Western culture, that modern culture, industrializing culture, whichever word you'd like to place there, over culture in Estes's language, her wording, that it can feel overwhelming at times. So you might feel yourself surprised, kind of like you spoke to, Ian, that there's a surprise all of a sudden. You're speaking something and all of it drums up, or it invokes or conjures something that you did not expect. And maybe, just maybe, it feels in the moment to you quite mammoth. And perhaps that you're not, maybe there's some sensing from parts of you that you're not yet ready for this, or maybe in this moment you're not yet resourced. So there's a couple of things in there. One, you might check in with yourself before engaging this offering, which is to say, do I feel psychospiritually resourced enough right now? Enough, not like you have to be in some pristine, perfect state, but that, do I feel resourced enough within myself, capable enough, willing enough to experience something that might be surprising to me, to experience the spontaneous, the emergent. And then the other one would be, if you've said yes to that, because we can't guarantee anything, you move into this practice and something arises that's really, really immense. The invitation is to titrate in and out of the experience. And so you may even just acknowledge that it's so immense and step out of, here's an example, you might step out of the lament portal and start jumping around and shaking your limbs off, so to speak, and just allowing some of the energy to discharge in whatever fashion feels right for you. And then if it feels appropriate to step back in, you might step back in and see, can I hang here a little bit longer? Where's the edge for me? And then step back out and allow yourself to run or jump up and down, or you might have a breathing practice of some kind. And prior to all of this, one example of a way to somatically engage this in a different way, in a more tangible way in your body for titration, would be something like going into like goddess squat in the yoga asanas, which is just, a regular wide leg squat. And you allow yourself to settle down into that shape, and then notice the moment, the palpable moment in your body where you sense the impulse to draw yourself out of the shape, and hang out there for just like 1 second longer, and then slowly come out, and then go back in, and you wait right at the edge when the impulse to remove yourself from the experience comes. Wait maybe a second longer, maybe you increase it to like 5 seconds or 10 seconds, and then you come out. And you're being curious. What you're doing is cultivating a curiosity for the experience in your body, because physiological emotional experiences come with particular narratives, and those narratives often govern the degree to which we experience something or are willing to experience it, as well as how we might perceive the experience. So we might be having a narrative that's hanging out in the background that we're not yet aware of, that's saying this is a unsafe experience, this emotion or this physiological sensation in my body is unsafe, and here's where it's attached to. And it's not to invalidate that, but to instead acknowledge it, come out of it, permission yourself to, and then practice curiosity and make your way back towards the actual sense-based experience in the body. So that would be my one my one little blip.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Beautiful. Thanks for that. Well, I guess we'll close up for today, the conversation that almost didn't happen. Thanks again, Amanda, for your time.
Thank you, Ian.
And yeah, and for the offering on the network and this one here. And the invitation is to practice this over the weekend, to craft the Lament Portal. Of course, at any point you can, but if you do over the weekend, the invitation is to come together with others on the network on Monday for a solstice council, which feels appropriate time to spiral back in and share a little bit about, what you experienced, what stirred, before we head into the threshold of Yule and that time. So yeah, once again, thanks for tuning in, and leave any questions, comments, below, and we'll see you on the other side.
Thank you.